While there have been modern protests against the statue's presence, there is an equally strong movement to keep it there. The revenge of the slave traders. The Civil War did not just end with the surrender at Appomattox. The final act of the war took place at Ford's Theatre, where the president was killed by an assassin who was part of a very large conspiracy. John Wilkes Booth, the shooter, was a Mason and a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. The conspiracy, of course, was much larger than Booth. The Masonic betrayal. 234 members of the organization were hanged for their roles and several others went to prison, but still a wider circle provided financial support. The conspiracy in the Lincoln assassination had as many mysteries as the Kennedy assassination would 100 years later. After Lincoln's death, Congress formed an assassination committee to determine if Andrew Johnson had played a role in the murder. Booth had visited Johnson's residence hours before the shooting. The assassin reportedly met with the future president in 1864 and even earlier, when he was the military governor of Tennessee. Johnson was one of 3 presidents to come from Tennessee. All 3 were Masons. He was the first president to receive the Scottish Rite degrees. Johnson was also the target of anti-Masons, and because the clergy had spoken out against him, he later requested that no clergy be present at his funeral. Lincoln had basically ignored Johnson since the president's inauguration day, and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, wrote a letter to a friend claiming that Johnson had a hand in her husband's murder. Congress, however, was no more able to find evidence of a conspiracy than it was 100 years later, when President Kennedy was removed from office by a bullet. Years after the Warren Commission determined that a lone assassin managed to kill President Kennedy with an anti-rifle, a new theory emerged. Kennedy had attempted to have Fidel Castro eliminated, and Kennedy's assassination was the retaliation. Coincidentally, Lincoln actually did instigate a plot to attack the Confederate capital at Richmond and kill the Confederate President, Jefferson Davis, and his cabinet. Colonel Ulrich Dahlgren was handpicked by Lincoln to lead the attack. Dahlgren was killed in the attempt, and papers found on his body pointed to the plot's origin in Washington. In retaliation, the plot to kill Lincoln was hatched by none other than Davis and his Secretary of State, Judah Benjamin. Benjamin was a unique individual who started in the Confederate government as Attorney General, and later became the Secretary of State. 234 From the sacred to the profane. Born in the British West Indies of Sephardic Jewish parents, he was part of a large and active Jewish community that thrived in the southern pre-Civil War states. Benjamin's mentor in the pre-Civil War period was John Slidell, an influential New Yorker who became a transplanted Southerner. Because it was in the interest of slave traders to expand the slave states, both Democrat Slidell and Whig leader Caleb Cushing pushed first to declare war on, and then to attempt to annex Mexico. Slidell's connections were very much tied to Europe, where his daughter married into the prestigious French Jewish banking house Erlanger et Cie. Slidell's niece married Auguste Belmont, who represented the even more prestigious Rothschild Bank. The friendships of Slidell helped Benjamin develop connections in Europe that benefited the South during the war. One of these benefits was the floating of a war bond by Erlanger in Europe to raise funds for the Confederate States. Benjamin also became the head of the Confederate intelligence. He established operations in Canada, where the South had hoped to bring in an ally against the Union. This failed, but the Canada connection was useful in getting money and in running operations. More than $1 million was held in Canada for the attempt to attack the White House and kill or kidnap the president. 2 weeks before the Lincoln assassination, Benjamin dispatched John Surratt to Canada. While there is little indication that Benjamin knew Surratt would play a role in the conspiracy, the Confederate Secretary of State helped destroy any evidence by burning all his papers and fleeing to England, where he practiced law. Benjamin was the only member of the Confederate government never to return to the United States. The murder of Lincoln was most likely planned from at least the time of his second inauguration, when 5 of the co-conspirators, Lewis Payne, George Atzerodt, David Herold, John Surratt, and Ned Spangler, were photographed together. Booth was a guest of the inauguration courtesy of Lucy Hale, the daughter of a senator from New Hampshire and Booth's fiancée. Just what precautions, if any, were taken to protect the president prior to the assassination is unknown. There was no Secret Service. The Masonic betrayal 235 detail, although Lincoln had a bodyguard, John Parker, a member of the Washington Metropolitan Police. Apparently not very diligent, Parker showed up late and took his seat outside the president's box at the theater. Since Parker could not see the play, he decided to find a better vantage point and simply left his post. Parker then invited 2 other Lincoln employees, his footman and coachman, to join the bodyguard for a drink in a nearby tavern. Investigators have never discovered where Parker actually was when the president was killed. There was no question where John Kennedy's security detail was many years later in the hours leading up to his assassination. 9 of them spent the previous night in a nightclub run by a friend of Jack Ruby, Pat Kirkwood. Ruby sent over strippers from his Carousel Club to entertain the Secret Service men, who were still drinking at 3:30 a.m. to a TLZ warning that the president would be assassinated in Dallas was ignored, and the parade route was changed at the last minute and not secured. The driver of the president's car hit the brakes after the first shot, and moved again only after the third. 3 Like Lincoln's security detail, Kennedy's much larger Secret Service was not held accountable for his death. Mortally wounded, President Lincoln was brought to the home of William Peterson, where several doctors, including Charles C. Taft, were present. Dr. Taft wasn't able to save the president, but he reportedly saved some of his hair, which ended up in a locket worn by Teddy Roosevelt at his inauguration. What went on at Peterson's house is lost to history, but another mysterious death occurred shortly after. William Peterson later committed suicide. The mortally wounded John Kennedy was brought to Parkland Hospital, and later to Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. The Parkland doctors completely disagreed with the inexperienced Bethesda doctors about the wounds and the directions of the bullets' entries and exits. 4 Yet the Dulles-controlled Warren Commission ignored the discrepancy. 5 Instead claiming that the Bethesda doctors were right, and the Parkland doctors had agreed with Bethesda's findings. The killers of both presidents were soon found and killed. There 236 from the sacred to the profane were persistent rumors that Booth actually survived his shooting, while the body of a patsy was used to give the illusion of Booth going to the grave. Other guests of the Lincolns at Ford's Theatre also met with gruesome deaths. For example, Henry Rathbone's wife, Clara, was reportedly stabbed to death by her husband before he tried to end his own life. He would be placed in an insane asylum. 10 years later, Mary Todd Lincoln would also find herself committed to an asylum. Her son Robert was in the White House when his father was shot, with President Garfield in 1881 when he was shot, and in Buffalo when President McKinley was shot in 1901. For a while Robert Lincoln had been business partners with some of the people connected to his father's death. Later Robert was shocked to discover documents implicating others who survived the plot. He is said to have destroyed the papers. The conspirators of Lincoln's assassination fled the scene, first to find help for Booth, who was wounded. The group, which included the soldier Boston Corbett, was caught. Corbett shot Booth, and was later declared insane, and sent to an asylum. Mary Sart, another arrested conspirator, was the first American woman condemned to death by hanging. Just before Mary's death, her daughter, Anna Sart, attempted to see President Andrew Johnson to get clemency for her mother. 2 men, both one-time senators, stopped Anna Sart. Senator Preston King would not see the year's end. He committed suicide by tying a bag of bullets around his neck and jumping off a ferry. Senator James Lane shot himself months later